Looking to make some healthier habits this holiday season? Make sure to check out our Moving Through Midlife community over on Facebook, as we are doing a Planksgiving event where we are doing daily plank workouts. We will be doing an advent for healthy, happy hips this holiday season, and then also have a sugar challenge, a 2-week sugar challenge that you might be interested in. Happy holidays!
Welcome to Raising Healthy Humans, where you as a busy mom can come each week to find information on health and wellness for your family. Enjoy experts discussing tips to help raise children through each phase of life. Gather current information on nutrition and wellness. And listen to Courtney, a personal trainer and founder of FormFit, to provide you with movement and posture tips along the way. It's our goal to help provide you with the information you need to help raise healthy humans.
Today, I'm speaking with Kyira Wackett, a mental health therapist who works with people in regards to shame, negative self-talk, and anxiety, and is here to help us navigate loving ourselves and ensuring we raise children who love themselves as well. Her company is called Adversity Rising, where she helps to empower you to live on purpose. Today, we are speaking about self-love and acceptance of our body, talking about the foods our children are eating and how to speak to them about the foods they eat in a neutral way, and then working with families in helping navigate how we should all be speaking to our children. I hope you all enjoy. Let's listen in.
Yeah, so I am a mom to an almost 2-year-old. I am a licensed mental health therapist in Portland, Oregon. My specialty as a therapist has been in the eating disorder and anxiety realm, with some specific trainings on trauma and things that have really allowed me to kind of broaden the scope of how I approach working with people with these diagnoses. I also own my own company called Adversity Rising. And basically my hope or my goal in launching this company was to take the things that I've learned in my master's program and my continued learning and training and in the therapy room and try to bring that out so it's more accessible for other people, whether it's tools like this, being on a podcast and kind of sharing these snippets and these pieces that I know, working with people in other settings, because as I'm sure many of your listeners are facing right now, there's a shortage of accessible therapy spots. There are wait lists that are tens, 20, hundreds long, unfortunately, in some cases. And so how do we get support appropriately out and matching people's needs when maybe not everyone needs to be in the room, but needs something different?
Okay. And your Adversity Rising, can you explain what that is? Your
Yeah.
website?
So my company is essentially everything is funneled on how to get people support in the most accessible way. My
Okay.
focus really is on addressing shame,
Mhm.
negative self-talk, and anxiety. So everything roots to that. Even as we get into our conversation today to talk about eating disorders, so much of this is rooted in the shame-based living and the cultures that we're in, internalized shame narratives. There's such a deep depth of that there. So I would say everything that you see, whether you're seeing the word shame or not, it's all kind of connected to or tethered to that root point. My website's really the hub for finding some free resources. So whether it's my blog posts, my videos that I do on YouTube, guest posts that I do on awesome other people's podcasts to kind of extend and connect with other people. And then really right now, my focus is on doing speaking events and trainings. I have a therapeutic book club where a small group of people get together and we process books. So we just did Brene Brown's Gifts of Imperfection, and we
Mhm.
talked about what that means and how that shows up for all of us. And then in January 2023, I'm launching my program, which is based on a modality that I've developed, a 5-step process on how to get out of shame and create a narrative that works for you, where you're writing your own story in your life rather than being controlled by shame, shoulds, and supposed tos.
Okay, that's great. Do you think here it is, it's Valentine's Day, and with these, all of us, moms, women, children, how can we go about finding ways to love ourselves in the body that we're in right now?
I think that one of the issues that we run into is that we are a culture of instant gratification and urgency. And so oftentimes, I think self-love has gotten wrapped up into that. How do I feel better? How do I do this? How do I call them Band-Aid solutions. So things that are going to make me feel better right now. And if we can't feel it right now, then we stop doing it. This is kind of the reason why New Year's resolutions. So we're in February right now. There's probably a lot of people that set something and are feeling as though they failed. It's this idea of, if I don't get it right away, then I should just stop. It's something that we call in therapy all or nothing thinking. So this idea that I have to be perfect or I don't do it. And unfortunately, self-love and self-care are practices. So a practice means it's something that we show up to every day. We invite it into our lives. Someday that might be taking an hour and engaging in some sort of behavior or activity that's really helpful. Some days it might be 2 minutes of an affirmation or 3 minutes of journaling, or even just simply going to bed when you're tired and nurturing your body and just showing it the love of listening to it when it's talking to you. So what happens, I think, is everybody wants it to be boiled down to, here's this answer, here's how you do it, and this is how you're going to feel better right away. But part of the issue is how we feel about our body is meant to change. So even somebody, when we talk about body positivity and loving our body, it's the same as when we talk about self-esteem. It ebbs and flows. So we all have this. There are days we feel like we're, mom to mom. I'm sure you felt this too. Days you felt like the worst mom on the planet. And then days you're like, whoa, I got this. That was a rock star mom moment. And then most moments are somewhere in between. They're in the gray.
Right.
So when it comes to our body, most days you're not going to feel like, whoa, this is great. I love it. I love everything about it. I wouldn't change anything. That might not even be attainable ever for people. But instead, what I like to think about is, how do we make space to not just be in a state of constantly shaming our body, to invite it to show up as it is and to honor what it's doing for us, whether that's saying something like, how my body's here with me today as I'm going on this walk that feels really hard and scary, or my body is here with me today when I was struggling shortly after having my daughter with some body image distress, and going, and my body is able to hold my daughter safely. And there are people that can't do that, or my body is able to heal itself after this amazing and traumatic experience of having a child. So I know I'm going about a very long answer to your question. That's not really a direct answer, but I think the goal is thinking, how do we shift out of outcome focus when we think about self-love and think about process focus? And maybe not the goal of saying, I want to love myself right now, but saying I'm going to work at showing myself love every day, even if I don't always feel like I get to the end of the day and love my body for everything that it is.
And I think I have heard people mention loving what your body does, and what you mentioned yourself, rather than what it looks like, because we really need to get out of that, what is it doing for us? All of the amazing things that it's doing for us, than rather what we see in the mirror.
Yeah. And so I go back and forth on this, because one of the things I remember, so I developed an eating disorder early in my college years. And I remember that when I was struggling, I had a lot of trauma. I think I had a lot of internalized narratives about what I should look like. I had friends that were all in very small bodies and looked a certain way, stick straight hair. They were all kind of the picture of what somebody was supposed to look like that looked like me. And so in my case, I present as white. I didn't know until a lot later in my life that I was Middle Eastern, which is why some of the things that having more hair on my body or having bushier hair on the top of my head, things that I was saying, well, why don't I look like these other girls? I look white. Why don't I look like these people? Because this is what a white girl is supposed to look like to be beautiful.
Right.
But I learned that I think a lot of it in the responses from my grandma, from other people in my life, they said things like, oh, it's what's on the inside, or beauty is this and that. And I do think that's important. And I think thinking about what our body does is important. I can tell you when I've approached this with people in eating disorder recovery in the therapy room and body image distress is there, the reality is we're still a visually experiencing world. And so what we look like is still a factor. So I think sometimes when we talk about, well, think about your legs are walking you to this place, your body's doing this thing, that's so important. And I don't want to dismiss the fact that you are still being looked at. You are still seeing your legs. You look in the mirror and you see your body. And so the answer can't be, well, just never look in a mirror again, or like never wash your body, or never, that kind of stuff.
Right.
But I think it's this idea of, what are you comparing it to? And who wrote the rules of that comparison guide? And when people think about that more, almost none of us buy into it. None of us really want to believe this is the only picture of beauty. And most of us don't even think that beauty or a great body looks just this way, but we've been conditioned to respond that way. So if instead we can say, yeah, of course it makes sense that I don't feel like my body looks great because this is what I've been told. And so give yourself self-compassion to say, so it would feel hard to love my body. I get to choose to love it anyways. And in the middle of that, thinking about all the ways that our body does add value to our life by, like you said, the things that it does or the way that we can connect to it.
Right. I completely 100% agree with everything you're saying. I think it's interesting to see also as time has gone on, how this beauty has changed. When I was a child, it was very different as to what was beautiful. And now, like my son, he's in high school and he talks about, what is considered beauty, not from his standpoint, but, what the other children or other kids, boys mention. And it's very different. So I find it very interesting to see how things change. And it's almost like it's going back to the 40s and 50s, like what they find beautiful. But we're also very different. So that makes it very difficult for someone who may not have that type of body to feel like they're being loved.
Yeah. And I think what you just pointed out is key from so many standpoints, that what we're sort of taught or the beliefs we're indoctrinated with about what's right or what's the correct place, or again, these ladder systems that are built that all of us are climbing up for success, for beauty, for value, they change all the time, which what that tells you is it's a moving target. You can't get there. So I think one of the big things to decide is, do you want to continue playing a game that's rigged, that leaves you feeling like crap every day? And this is harder. So when we talk to our kids, when we talk to, middle schoolers, teenagers, they're starting to understand the world in this way. But it's hard to get them to see that because their world is based on this element of comparison and being conditioned to want to fit in, because everybody wants to belong, but we confuse it with fitting in. And fitting in is, how do I conform and look like, act like, be like everybody around me? So I think you brought up a really key point of recognizing it changes all the time on the outside, and our experience of our body changes all the time on the inside. So even for anybody listening, think about how you could feel great or even neutral in your body, didn't feel a certain way, and then you ate a meal and suddenly you hate your body. Or you felt really good and then you put on a pair of pants that didn't fit the way that you remembered them fitting, and suddenly you go down a spiral of hating your body. Well, look how rapidly that changed. The only thing that changed was whether or not you had a pair of pants on or not, but suddenly now your body is worse than it was before because this one pair of pants doesn't fit. So also thinking about how much our experience of our bodies ebbs and flows. So this, like, our internal system changing, the external system changing, focusing on trying to get to a point that you feel good just seems like it's a waste of time and energy, because ultimately you're going to be feeling that, again, like I said, that all or nothing and everywhere in the gray your whole life.
Right. And when you mention all of this, I have to wonder, how are we working on raising our children to start to feel this self-love? Because it is, like you said, it's ever changing. And is it the way we're communicating to them? Is it like, what do you feel is the way that we can start helping them when we are obviously, like you said, it's this ebb and flow. We are ever changing. It's always going to be changing. So how can we help them move through this?
I think so. My focus since I started my therapy practice, but then in particular, I think it's been enhanced since becoming a mom, has been food neutrality, body connectivity.
Okay.
So, how do I help instill neutral views about food and a connection to the body? Because again, I think body positivity suggests this idea that you're going to feel amazing all the time. And body positivity still has a place. And I very much stand by the work of people in the body positive field and in health at every size. And that work is really valuable. When I think about how I talk about a body every day with my daughter, when I think about how I talk about it with patients, I really want to focus on body connectivity. Okay. So the thing that I think about is it's not just how our body looks like that we start to kind of shame. We get upset with our body when it's tired, when we feel like we should keep going. We get upset with our body when we feel sick, when we feel sluggish, when it's sending us a message that it feels anxious, when we feel like we shouldn't be and we should be fine. And so we start to really view our body as a nuisance rather than something to have a relationship with. And I think this starts to happen as a little kid. And we can condition that in the messages that we use about our own bodies when we talk about it to our children, in the messages they're receiving from the world at large. And then over time, it's this one relationship you have your entire life, you and your body. Again, like we've said, it's ever changing, but it's consistent in the fact that it's always there. And so how do we help empower that connection? So that, again, I might say, man, my hair is something since I was a little kid I've still struggled with. I'm having a really bad hair day today. That doesn't take away from my value. And it doesn't mean that every part about my body is not okay. It's okay that I feel uncomfortable with my hair today. I still get to show up and have a good day. Breaking that down, because you're thinking, how do we start to apply this to the way that we talk to our kids, that we talk to young people? I think a lot of this has to do with first turning inwards and being honest with ourselves about just how many things we're saying and doing that suggest a discomfort and a hatred towards our body. So how often are we talking about foods in a good or bad way? How often are we talking about shaming? Are we shaming ourselves for what we ate or didn't eat, or saying we can't eat that, or we shouldn't eat this, or we're not eating this thing, or we talk about our weight, or we talk about our size? Our kids pick up on that. Our kids are paying attention to this. And what we know is one of the predominant risk factors for developing an eating disorder or severe disordered eating and body image distress has a lot to do with family culture and norms. So if you have somebody in your life that experienced an eating disorder or disordered eating, severe dieting, you're at risk. And then in particular, depending on how those views and values were brought into your everyday culture. So thinking, do you talk about food in that way? Is it good or bad? Is it a treat as opposed to maybe a sometimes food? Can we shift the terminology that we use so that it's not making it, we're not giving food a value that it doesn't need to have because it's purely fuel for consumption and energy. When it comes to the body, then can we talk about our body in a way that is, I think, flexible? So there are days that I have really bad body image days, and I have a little girl. And so, or at this point in time, she identifies as a female. So I am talking to her about my body, and I'm talking to her about things. She's gotten curious, even just about, Mom's having a really hard body image day. Mom's feeling a little uncomfortable in her body today. My body is showing up and it's allowing me to be here with you. Today I'm just feeling a little off, and that's okay. Some days we just don't feel great in our body. And so how do you talk about that? And again, she's 2. So I talked to her about it very differently than a parent of a middle schooler or a high schooler. When they get older, what I suggest is talk to them about their experience in their body. What do they feel? What do they notice in their body? How do we help them develop those cues? And how do we make it normal to have those experiences of not feeling great in their body without allowing that to define the experience of their body or to define their worth as a person because of that experience?
Okay. And when you mention the food with good or bad, how do you communicate? And you may not notice this quite at your daughter's age, but I have teenagers, and the choices that are made are sometimes not always the best. So how do you start to communicate to them about what, how should we be talking about certain foods? I mean, I try not to say good and bad, but what are you recommending?
Well, let's think about that, because this is a great example. And this comes up a lot when I do, in particular. So I've worked at hospitalization levels of care for kids and early adolescence, early adulthood age. So a lot of the conversations are around, what are we wanting to say? So let's think about, for your kids, what do you see as the problem for them?
They're eating way too many carbs.
Okay. And so give me an example of something that they pick regularly that you're like, oh, I'm not okay with this, or this doesn't sit right with me.
So it's not so much what they're eating, it's the amount that they're eating. So, I try to keep things fairly clean in the house because I do know it starts with me as to what I bring in. But when they're they're telling me how hungry they are and they're eating a pile of pretzels rather than grabbing a bowl of fruit when, and the fruit is going bad and the pretzels or, whatever boxes of whatever I'm buying, the stuff that I try to keep at a minimum, is constantly, there's nothing to eat, mom, but there's fruit going bad everywhere. And they just want the processed foods in the cabinet.
And is it more problematic to you that the food is going bad, or that they're eating the pretzels, or that they're telling you that they have a problem and the solution they're going towards isn't actually helping them with the problem? Because you're also describing foods that are fast energy users, or it breaks down, so they're not going to feel full if that's what they're choosing to eat. So which area do you find yourself feeling like the problem lies for you?
For me, because of what I know, my issue is they're not eating the nutrient dense foods that they need to sustain them for the activities they're in.
Right. So then what I would suggest, and you said they're both teenagers, is that right?
I have 3, 2 are teenagers.
3.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and the teenagers are the ones that are grabbing the pretzels.
Well, they all are, but 16, 14, and 10.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then I think the conversations become more about empowering choice, because you also know, like, let's just take your 16-year-old. Hypothetically, if they move out in a few years, they may grab pretzels all day long if they want to. And so what we want to be, and what I think a lot of the conversation is thinking about what is the takeaway lesson for them and how do we empower them to apply the information. So again, this looks very different when you're talking to your 16-year-old and your 10-year-old, because the way they think about things is different right now. But I think the consistent message to them is, here's this problem. You're telling me that you're hungry all the time. It sounds like the solution that you've tried is to grab pretzels, to grab chips, to grab whatever these things are that they're grabbing. It seems like the problem is still standing, that you're still hungry all the time. So it sounds like your solution isn't working. What could we try that looks different? And one thing, and this is where and I know you have more knowledge than maybe some people might have in terms of energy and food and what we're getting out of our foods, but talking to them and using that and saying something that I've learned over time is how to get the energy that I need while still allowing those foods to be a part of what I eat. So what would happen if we grabbed a small bowl of pretzels and some peanut butter and maybe some apple slices? I wonder what would happen if we tried that instead of just the bag of pretzels. Let's see how that would work, and allowing them to kind of try that out and to empower the solutions. Because what we're wanting to get at for them is, you're telling me that you're hungry, and your body is telling you that it needs different and more fuel than what you're giving it.
Mhm.
So if we just keep trying the same thing, that is a slow erosion of listening to your body. And it is allowing you to kind of get depleted on the energy so you can't function. And especially if that keeps happening, you're not going to have the bandwidth to even think about different solutions because you're just going to be too low in energy. So in that instance, I think allowing those conversations, and then again, I'm very new to this in terms of like parenting realization, but I've learned it a lot, even as a therapist, is most of it is just trying to plant the seeds and then having to walk away from the outcome of what they turn into. And so I think shifting that and that conversation, how's that sitting with you as we talk about that?
Oh, well, you must have seen my sigh. Well, everything sounded great until you said sitting with whatever choices.
Yeah.
I was like,
yes.
Oh, okay. It's very difficult.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the hard part is most of us didn't come to the information that we have and want the things that we want without going through our own struggles, whether that is severe trauma, stuck points in our lives, getting depression or feeling depressed, even if it's not clinical depression, living in that state of self-loathing and shame. And so when we get to that point of learning how to approach that more effectively, we want to alleviate that suffering for everyone, but in particular for our kids. We don't want them to feel what we felt.
Right.
And so, and I did this a lot. I'm a little bit, I think probably hypervigilant. I joke that as my daughter gets older, she's gonna be like, Mom, do we have to talk about our emotions today? Can this just be like, I screwed up, move on? Like, but we talk so much about this because I want for her to have the opportunity and the flexibility to do the things I didn't do or didn't have the skills or didn't have the support to do. And so, yeah, I think that is that piece of also not, if we get stuck to the outcome, then it ultimately becomes about us and not about our kids. And so realizing that you are doing a great job by trying to control what you can control, like you said, what you're bringing into the house, how you talk about food. But in reverse, if we make it so that we're unintentionally shaming them for picking the pretzels versus empowering them to come up with a different solution, we're just taking what we experienced it and repackaging it in a different way. So loosening that allows them to see, all right, Mom cares a lot and wants me to make these different choices because of this, or wants to empower me to think about solutions that work for me long-term. They might still pick the pretzels.
Right.
You know, the same as I present different solutions to Everly, she still might pick the thing that I'm trying to help her get away from. And then having to walk away with knowing, is she safe? Is she okay? And can I let go of feeling like I'm a bad parent if what she chooses and how she explores the world looks this way?
Okay. And when you talk about how you're speaking about food, does that then also play into, instead of saying good and bad, you always hear like, these are grow foods, or would you even not go into that?
I think what people find that works for them is great. There's always going to be a naysayer and what would the opposite be? A yay-sayer? Yeah, I guess that's what it is for all aspects. So for a while there was like red and green foods, and Weight Watchers made like a kids app that was supposed to help with watching what you're eating. And you can see how there's good intention. Everything I think has a capacity to be unhelpful or become rigid. So I think the biggest thing I've learned, and so in my training, I've worked mostly with kind of the 11, 12 to 18-year-olds when we're thinking about kids.
Okay.
Again, I now have a very young kid, so I'm having to kind of learn through experience and a lot of grace of what that looks like to apply it to a younger kid as well. But I think a lot of it is, how do we talk about things as flexibly as possible? So one thing, my daughter loves to watch Sesame Street, and they have a couple sections on there where they talk about food. And one thing that they use that she liked it, she resonated with it, she picked up on it, was a sometimes food. So we talk about like, we sometimes have this food and we sometimes have these foods. And what does it look like what are some foods we have every day? What are some foods that we have sometimes? what are some foods that we have during different occasions that mean different things for us, or maybe are tied to these things. So rather than it being a treat on your birthday, it's something that becomes a tradition of something we have or something we do. So it still feels special, but in a different way. So I think finding what works for you and your family, the thing I'd like to avoid is if you get rigid in it with yourself. So I have a client who is struggling with the fact she's like, okay, as soon as my kid was born, I was like, clean eating. I'm going to make all their stuff. I'm never going to buy Go-Gurt. I'm never going to buy the prepackaged snacks. I'm never going to do this. And last year, Portland and a lot of Oregon got hit with a very severe ice storm. And there was like hundreds of thousands of people without power for over a week. And most of us were doing what we could, navigating this to the best of our abilities. Thankfully, it was cold out, so some stuff stayed okay outside, but you're working with what you got.
Right.
So your plan goes out the window. So she's like, all right, and I had to buy a Go-Gurt and I had to do this. The problem wasn't that her kid had a Go-Gurt. The problem was that she carried shame for months about not following through on this is what I'm going to do. So I think however we talk about food, we have to really believe it rather than just trying to sell our kids on something different. And so, you know, when in my eating disorder, I didn't eat certain foods. There were foods that were no foods. You don't eat them. My eating disorder was very focused on calories. Everybody shows up in a very different way, but mine was very calorie driven. And so when we first started making things like waffles or stuff like that, I was like, oh, I could feel it come up. And it's like, how do you talk about this? And I'm 10 years in recovery and I still have these thoughts. Well, I had to talk to her about waffles are so good. They're really, really tasty. We're going to have waffles and we're going to give our belly all sorts of goodness. So we get this from the waffles and kind of breaking down what kind of nutrients she gets. And then we're going to have some veggies and we get this from our veggies. And what we talk about is how do we give our belly everything it needs so that it can help our body do all the things it wants. But yeah, talking about it in a way where I say sometimes food, or, you know, what does healthy mean, or what is a certain type of food mean? I really have to make sure that I believe it as opposed to just selling her on it too.
Yeah. Well, and it starts with us in regards to that, all of that. And you had mentioned earlier on about in regards to going back to self-image with you and how you felt about yourself. With your daughter, now that you have a daughter, do you notice how you have to change how you speak about yourself? I'm just thinking of like when you mentioned your hair was different than all of your friends. And I have caught myself with my daughter. I'm same way in regards to my hair. My hair was always this weird wavy. It wasn't, you know, it's not straight and it's not curly. It's that in between. And I've caught myself making comments, not ugly to her, just like, oh, your hair is like mommy's hair. But then I may have also said before something about how I don't like certain things with my hair, you know? So, I mean, you know, obviously I would never mean to say something negative about my daughter's hair. I don't mean anything like that. But how do you work through your own issues and how you might be saying things to your children?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with, again, if we go back to kind of our original question and the idea of self-love and self-care as a practice, I think recognizing and being kind to ourselves on the days that we just don't get it right. So I have certain beliefs about how I want to raise my daughter. I've definitely dropped the F-bomb a couple of days ago in front of her. And I made and I used to swear a lot, and I made a commitment not to swear in front of her at all.
Right.
And it came out and I'm like, oh, that is rough. And then you have to go, and I'm human. And she didn't even notice it, but it was this idea of even if she did, it's okay.
Right.
So I think one thing that happens is, in particular for parents and caregivers, we put so much pressure on ourselves to get everything right. And we have this very specific way that we want to approach things. And we forget to allow that flexibility of the human experience. And again, we're emotional beings. We're not we're not logic beings. We want to be. If we could be in our head all the time, that's where most people want to live. And that's why we have such a difficult time engaging. We disconnect from the emotions. And sometimes our emotions are going to show up and they're going to take over. And let's just say, for example, you had a day where, maybe you had something go wrong with a podcast recording and you had a crappy email that came out that you were dealing with this, like all these things layered up. And then you looked in the mirror, your hair just, for whatever reason, felt unsettling in that moment and it came out. And rather than judging yourself for it, I think just showing up with kindness and saying, ooh, my shame was in the driver's seat right there. And then what I do, because I still say things every once in a while, is then I talk about that in front of her. And that's where my joke comes in. If she's probably going to be like, Mom, we don't have to process this. But when I do catch it, I'll pause and I'll explain to her why what I said doesn't sit right with me and what I want to take out of that or what I meant in what I said. And so I think that's the really helpful part. I think the other thing is realizing we could never say anything negative. You cannot control the hundreds of thousands of other interactions she's going to have anyways, or that he's going to have, or they're going to have. So where our kids, they're going to experience the world in its complexity. So I think the best thing is to not try to be perfect, but just to allow imperfection to be something that is talked about openly without it being a shame-based thing.
Right. And also everyone's perception of things are different. And she may, your child may not even, that may be something that doesn't even bother them, but it bothers you because you have this preconceived notion or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the thing is, and this comes up now, I mean, especially when we're thinking about it, it's not just how do we raise our kids to love their bodies. It's also thinking about, especially at 2, my daughter doesn't have the ability to tell me how she identifies in her body. I don't know how she feels in her body. And we see this as kids get older. And this particularly comes up when we think about gender and presentation of self, even within gender presentation, but also just presentation of the self in general. How do we want to show up? How do we feel? How do we like our body to be? How does our body serve and work for us? So I think sometimes also not putting our view and our responses based on our experience of the world and our interpretation of the world, but also allowing that to be something too. So when I think about stuff with her, what I realize is I'm going to screw up all the time.
Right.
Because for right now, we're talking to her and using she, her pronouns, and everything that we've done is to try to condition a very neutral approach to her body and how she views things. Well, what if she comes out very strongly and doesn't like that that's the way that we approach it? She actually really strongly identifies and wants her body to be talked about in a certain way. And so I also think best intention doesn't always align with the outcome we expect it to be either. So again, that's where I think that flexible grace and just saying, how can we be as neutral and process oriented as possible today? Show up with whatever you can today, do the best that you can, take from it what you can to learn to be better, stronger, wiser, whatever it is tomorrow, and then let the rest go.
And how do we control all of that when it goes beyond us? We're talking family members. Like how do we work through that and navigate it with them? Is that something you have to set aside time to communicate with them, or how do you usually recommend that?
I think a lot of this comes to, again, stage of parenthood. So the age of your child, because obviously if you are pregnant or have a young kid or you're adopting and they're a young child, some of the conversations can be had right away. If you have certain ideals or things that you want, it doesn't mean the conversations are one and done, but what that looks like to have those conversations might be different than having a 14, 15, 16-year-old that is maybe struggling with some body image distress and trying to help grandma understand that when you make comments about how their body looks, that's really triggering versus, again, just, I want to get away from this for our household in general. And I've got kids all over the board and no one's struggling necessarily, but I want to change it. So I think context depends on it for people. I think the biggest thing comes back to controlling what you can control. And I can send you these so you can put them in the notes so people have them, because I know for some people having the written down things to say can be helpful. There's kind of I think about pocket phrases. So things that I can use in the moment to communicate my needs or my daughter's needs, or in this case, when we're thinking about anybody and their kids or their family's needs, in a way that isn't unintentionally shaming the other person, but inviting them to be a support for what you're trying to do. And that's really hard because, let's pretend it's the same family member. Everybody's got one, or a friend, or somebody that we know is going to say something, whether it's their own diet talk, their own body shaming. They're going to comment on what your kid puts on their plate. The biggest things that come up for parents is they'll comment on how much their kid is eating or how skinny their kid is. That's a big one that comes up, or making comments about how much they're eating in relation to, like, should they be eating that? Like those like under the table comments that you're like, in what realm of reality does that feel helpful? But it does to them for whatever way.
Right.
So one of the things that I really like to say, or kind of the model that I use, is when you talk about X. So, when you comment about how much that so-and-so puts on their plate, it sends the message that there's a right amount to put on their plate, or that what they've put on their plate isn't correct. I know you care about them and you want to support us in raising our kids to be as blank as possible. Let's say, maybe as food neutral or as body positive, or whatever the terminology is for your family. Would you mind trying not to make those comments as a way to support us in doing that? And they might say, sure, great. And then do it again the next time you see them.
Right.
So it's sometimes the unintentional not listening to the boundary. And then sometimes they might just say no, or push back and say that's dumb, or, in whatever way, just kind of dismiss it. I think take the person and the context into account, and again, recognize what's in your control. I always want to approach it as, I want to know that it's in my control to be an advocate for Everly to have the best possible experience of how she shows up in the world. It's not in my control to make everybody say things the way I wish they would say them. And so when, I have family members who make a lot of comments about their own appearance, and that's really bothersome to me, and I've given them feedback 5, 10, 15 times saying, ooh, okay. And I'll follow it up now by saying, what's something positive about your body, or what's something this way? And I'll model it that way. But I've had to accept they're probably always going to make these comments, and that's okay.
Right.
A couple other things that you could say is you could say something like, maybe I've made a commitment to not talk about weight or food or bodies with my kids. I would really appreciate if you didn't do that as well when you're around us, or would you be able to support us in that? And that's a big thing I think about, is would you be able to support us doing blank? So It's this ask, it's the invitation. I also think it's really helpful to include something like, I know you care about so-and-so, I know that you care about Susan, and it's really important to you that she has the best life possible. One of the ways that we want to do that is this. Would you be able to support us in that process? And that really helps them reconnect to not getting defensive, like they did something bad, but thinking about learning how to be a better support for this individual.
Okay. And one more question for you in regards to this body image. I noticed that, it's usually having to do with a certain body image, but I'm noticing, and I don't know if it's a concern, my husband and I are both healthy, fitness, I'm in the fitness field. My husband works out every day, and we're noticing our son is, he's in football, he's doing weightlifting, he is very slender, so he's seeing all of his muscles. Is there a concern of it going the other way to where it could be a dangerous thing as well?
Meaning more so like, because your son is in a slender body, because your son is seeing these things, there could be is there a way that it could go too far?
Yeah. And I think, I have heard where these kids now have gotten to where, they have to have the 6-pack abs. They have to have, So how do you work with them? Because what he's doing, it's all positive. So how do we kind of rein him in to help him not get too focused on that?
Yeah. I think everything again is sort of, what's the balance? And so to answer your question, yes, it definitely can go to an extreme. In particular, what we see is, depending upon how somebody identifies, if you are socialized female, oftentimes appearance in terms of weight and
Mm-hmm.
fat content on the body is where the focus gets placed because of how we are conditioned to view our body.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also conditioned to see our bodies as sort of service entities and to make ourselves smaller. And so there's a lot of subliminal messaging for women in our country and our culture that suggests being in a smaller body doesn't just look better, but is better all around.
Mm-hmm.
So the assumptions that are made about bodies in different sizes.
Mm-hmm.
For people that are socialized male, their bodies are conditioned to be about acts of doing. So muscle tone, appearance, size, things like that become more important. I think that's where that culture of, the six pack abs, the looking a certain way is kind of sought after. Again, I think rather than focusing on, saying something like, it's really great that you are using your muscles and helping them get stronger.
Mm-hmm.
It would also be really great to do that. And your body might not always show that, or there might be people whose bodies don't show their abs maybe as obviously as yours do, that are doing healthy things, that have equally valuable bodies, things like that. So there's that conversation.
Right.
But I think kind of, again, you're asking more specifically within the family, what do you pay attention to? How do you notice it? Again, I just think about balance. It's like sleep is a really healthy thing. We can sleep too much. We can sleep too little, Let's use even just the example of an apple. So that's one thing I've used when I talk about things like apples are really great food. If I only ever ate apples, it's not giving my body everything that it needs. And that would be super uncomfortable.
Right.
And so what does it look like to talk about in moderation as opposed to kind of like overemphasis on something? And that could be the switch from somebody who's concerned their kid is playing video games too much or in front of a computer too much. Taking that away isn't helpful. Helping them understand how to integrate time into doing these activities while also doing other things is helpful. For your son, if it was like, yeah, he's not hanging out with his friends, or the only time he hangs out with his friends, he's going to the gym, or suddenly he's, not wanting to eat certain foods, or, I'm going to use the pretzels example again, because we used it. Suddenly he's not wanting pretzels, or he wants a certain kind, or he's only eating this. You just start to notice it and pay attention. What I think is the other thing we all have to accept is that every person on this planet has some form of disordered eating and body image distress. That's just normal.
Okay.
There is no perfect way to exist. We're all going to have times where we eat a little bit more or a little bit less, or we're changing the way we eat because we're judging our body or we need it to look a certain way, or we just feel like crap in our bodies, and that's okay. And so normalizing that, and then realizing again, your goal with him is, it sounds like fitness is an important part of your life. And that's really cool because we share in that. And for you and your husband, you've had to learn what that looks like in balance with everything else.
Right.
So saying, yeah, something that, Dad and I have learned is this, and this is kind of how we balance it. So we get the time to do this while also doing these other things. How do you balance that and make sure you still have time with your friends, time for these other fun things, time for activities that aren't movement driven, that kind of thing?
Okay, perfect. That's great. Thank you so much for that. Because I think we get stuck in one aspect, but I do think that there's two sides. And I think, I see it with some clients who get they get overly into, the fitness. And like you said, that becomes everything that they're doing. And they're not then focusing on, and I don't mean specifically for any of my current clients, but that it becomes excessive. So excessive good, excessive, well, here I went with the good and the bad, but you know what I mean? Like there is good and bad on both sides, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like you can do too much of anything, like the apple.
Right. Yes. And I think it comes back to empowering choice and understanding intention. So what is the intention? So there are some times where I know I have a client, and it's really hard to not always have the eating disorder lens on as a therapist, but not every person has an eating disorder just because they're engaging in certain activities. So one of the conversations I've had with somebody is, there are times that they work out that is tied to a form of punishment of the body or shaming of the body. I ate something and I'm feeling really crappy. And I have to work out an extra workout because I shouldn't have eaten this burger. Or I shouldn't have done this thing. Well, that's reinforcing a belief that that food was bad and that your body is not okay. And that you don't trust that your body knows what to do with that food. That's the biggest thing. That's that erosion of trust with the body. So you're trying to come in and control it now by doing these things to make it better. That's a very different intention than maybe somebody who is learning how to use movement as a form of balancing anxiety. And they're in a period where they are having a ton of anxiety. And maybe they did 2 or 3 short bursts of yoga or a bike workout or something during the day because they had a really hard day. And that was the skill that they had accessible to them in that moment to use.
Right.
You could look at both people and say, you worked out 3 times today. That's bad. Or you could say, you worked out 3 times today. Tell me more about what's going on with that. Or, you missed a day at the gym and you're feeling really bad about that. Tell me why, versus just assuming, it's X, Y, or Z, or, whatever that kind of the narrative is that we put on it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's excellent. And always asking the why. I think that's very important in regards to that. All right. Well, thank you. I want to respect your time. Where can we find you and how can people work with you?
I'll send all of this. We can post it down below too. I think the best way to connect with me is to send me an email directly. Just reach out if you have questions, want to talk about how we could work together, how I could support you. I don't do any social media anymore. It's a really positive change I made for myself. So the only way to kind of get regular updates from me is to sign up for my email list. So I'll put the link for that in there for you, and people can get content there that I don't share anywhere else. It's just twice a month. So it's not like a daily email trying to sell you on something. It's purely information sharing. And I think just taking some time to look at my website and getting a feel for me and my style and seeing if I'm the right fit. I think the most important thing, I'm sure you see this all the time when you talk to your clients as well, is I know what I'm talking about, but that's less important than you connecting to and feeling like you can work with me to handle these hard things, because we could Google most of the information that we're talking about right now, but it's about finding somebody that you trust and want to be open with. So starting there, seeing how it feels, and then, reaching out and connecting with me. Like I said, I'm launching a program in January 2023 that I'm really excited about. So I'll have some information available for that soon for people to see if maybe that's kind of the next step in that internal reframing and rewriting process.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to make sure the listeners know before you leave?
I think maybe just coming back to, if you're taking, this is a lot that we covered. Obviously, we could have talked about this for another 3 or 4 hours and still not even tapped to the surface.
Right.
So I think maybe closing it with more so the mantra that I've established for myself is to have flexible grace in a relentless pursuit for living my best life or showing up in the way that I want. And so being kind to ourselves, that is the epitome of how we deal with shame, is to show up with kindness and openness while still pursuing and still driving and still being open to that and seeing this entire thing as a process. And I think the last thing I'll say is I had a therapist who I was working with. She was actually my supervisor for a period of time. And I was really worried about something that I said. And I was like, what if I triggered them to do this? And what if this happens and they go home and, they have a hard time following their meal plan or whatever. I forget exactly what it was. And she said, I think you have to remember that you're not that important. And I don't mean this to say that as parents and caregivers, we're not important.
Right.
But when we hyperfixate on one thing that we said, we take ourselves out of experiencing what it means to be in a relationship with our kids and with a relationship with ourselves. And so again, just realizing we're going to screw up. You have to allow that to happen and realize that the more important thing is that we show up in our values and we're consistently there as opposed to getting it right every time.
That's so great. Thank you so much for that. I would definitely say having a teenager makes you realize how unimportant you are.
And that's okay. And then you go, okay, so maybe the pretzels discussion isn't going to come from me. Is there somebody else that's, that we can lean on? Like I use Sesame Street. I'm sure your son maybe doesn't want to hear it from Sesame Street, but there might be someone.
Right.
And then we go, okay, so maybe that's how I show up consistently and with what they need, rather than assuming that it has to all be on me and then shaming myself if it doesn't work out the way I feel like it should.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to listen to our podcast. I hope you found this information valuable and hope that you are able to immediately use some of the information that was provided. Make sure to check out the show notes for all the links that we discussed today. I also wanted to let you know that if you are a mom who is wanting to begin to start making healthier choices, but are not sure where to start or don't feel like you have a lot of time, I want to let you know that I offer a 5-day challenge that is free for you to get started on making small changes each day. It provides you with a quick 5-minute movement or workout routine, along with a 5-day meal plan with family-friendly meals you will enjoy, and a tip that will help you to find ways to move and live healthier. Just head to formfitnaples.com/fit5 to sign up. Again, that information will be in our show notes, so just head there, click on that link, and you'll be able to get started with the 5-day challenge immediately. Now make sure to go out and enjoy your day while practicing small, healthy choices that will make lasting changes.